In 1979, Singapore recorded one of the most disturbing unsolved crimes in its modern history. In less than 30 minutes, 4 children were killed inside their own home. No valuables were taken. No forced entry was found. No fingerprints were recovered. And despite decades of investigation, no one has ever been convicted. Statistically, crimes of this nature are rare. Familial child homicides committed by an external perpetrator without theft, without noise, and without immediate detection account for only a fraction of violent crimes worldwide. Even more unusual is when such an act occurs in a densely populated residential block during morning hours, when neighbors are awake and daily routines are already in motion. Yet that is precisely what happened on the morning of May 6, 1979, in Singapore. These horrifying stories are more than just cold headlines on the front page. They are sharp slices of the darkest corners of human nature, where the lines between safety and danger collapse inside ordinary homes. To not miss any of the next files, any of the criminal portraits I am about to open, hit subscribe and the notification bell icon now. Because in the world of crime, the truth never gets old. At the center of this case was the Tan family. A working-class household of 6, living a quiet life in a small apartment at Block 58 in Geylang Bahru. Tan Queen, 38 years old, and his wife, Lee Ming, 30 years old, earned a living by transporting school children. They saved for years to buy a small bus. He drove. She assisted. Their work demanded discipline and punctuality, and so did their family routine. Their 4 children were young. The eldest was 10. The second, 8. The third, 5. The youngest, a daughter, was also 5 years old. Neighbors described them as polite, well-behaved, and closely bonded. Every morning followed the same pattern. The parents woke before dawn, prepared for work, and left the apartment around 6:35. The children remained asleep, waking later to get ready for school together. On that particular morning, nothing appeared out of place. The parents left as usual. The door was closed. The children were sleeping. At 7:10, Lee Ming called home, as she often did, using the household landline as a wake-up alarm. No one answered. She called again. And again. The line remained silent. Concerned, she asked an elderly neighbor to knock on the door. There was no response. The neighbor suggested the children had already gone to school. By 10 o'clock that morning, when the parents returned home, that assumption collapsed. Inside the apartment, the children were not missing. They were dead. All 4 of them. Killed inside the bathroom. Their lives ended violently in a space meant for privacy and safety. From the very beginning, the case defied logic. There was no sign of a break-in. Nothing was stolen. The crime appeared deliberate, targeted, and meticulously executed. Whoever entered that apartment was not a stranger to the routine inside it. This is not only the story of a massacre. It is the story of silence. Of a crime committed in plain sight in a crowded neighborhood and then swallowed by time. And nearly half a century later, the question remains unanswered. Who walked through that door, and why were 4 children the price that was paid? Before the tragedy, the Tan family lived a life defined by routine, discipline, and quiet perseverance. They were not wealthy, nor were they socially prominent. They were a working-class family doing what millions of others did in Singapore during the late 1970s, working long hours, saving carefully, and building stability one day at a time. Tan Queen was 38 years old in 1979. His wife, Lee Ming, was 30. They married young and became parents quickly. By the time many of their peers were still establishing their careers, the Tans were already raising 4 children. Their financial situation required constant effort. To support the household, the couple pooled their savings and purchased a small bus, which they used to transport children to and from school. Tan Queen drove the vehicle. Lee Ming worked alongside him as a co-driver, managing schedules, assisting the children, and handling payments. Their work demanded precision. School transportation left little room for error. Being late was not an option. That need for punctuality shaped the family's daily rhythm. Each morning began before sunrise. Breakfast was simple and quick. By 6:35, the parents would lock the door and leave for work, trusting that their children would wake shortly afterward and prepare for school together. The family lived in a modest apartment at Block 58 in Geylang Bahru. The building was part of a densely populated residential area, typical of Singapore's urban housing at the time. Neighbors lived close to one another. Sounds of daily life carried easily through hallways and stairwells. Privacy existed, but isolation did not. Inside the apartment, space was limited. There were no unused rooms, no hidden corners. Every area served a function. The children shared sleeping spaces. The bathroom, small and functional, was not a place where anyone lingered. It was a practical home, shaped by necessity rather than comfort. The 4 children were at the center of the household. The eldest son, 10 years old, had already begun to assume a sense of responsibility. Teachers described him as attentive and protective of his younger siblings. The second son, 8, followed closely behind, often mirroring his older brother's behavior. The third child, a 5-year-old boy, was energetic and curious. The youngest, a 5-year-old daughter, was described as gentle and quiet. Neighbors remembered the children as polite and well-behaved. They played together, walked to school together, and were rarely seen alone. Their bond was reinforced by the parents' work schedule, which required the siblings to look after one another during the early morning hours. This arrangement was not unusual at the time. Many families operated under similar circumstances, relying on trust, routine, and community familiarity. On the morning of May 6, 1979, nothing appeared unusual. Tan Queen and Lee Ming woke at 6 o'clock, as they always did. They prepared for work, ate breakfast, and left the apartment at 6:35. All 4 children were still asleep. The door was closed and locked behind them. At 7:10, Lee Ming placed a call home from a nearby phone, following a habit she had developed over time. The call served as a backup alarm, a way to ensure the children woke on time for school. The phone rang. No one answered. She called again. Still nothing. On the 3rd attempt, the line remained silent. Concerned, but not alarmed, she contacted an elderly neighbor who lived nearby and asked her to knock on the apartment door. The neighbor complied, knocking several times. There was no response. After waiting, the neighbor suggested that the children may have woken earlier than usual and left for school. The explanation seemed reasonable. Relieved, Lee Ming returned her attention to work. By 10 o'clock, the parents returned home. The first sign that something was wrong was subtle. The apartment was quiet. The children were not in their sleeping area. Assuming they were at school, Tan Queen and Lee Ming moved through the apartment. When they reached the bathroom, the illusion of normalcy collapsed. The scene they encountered would alter their lives permanently. All 4 children were inside the bathroom. Their bodies had been stacked together. Blood covered the floor and walls. The violence was overwhelming, immediate, and impossible to comprehend. Lee Ming collapsed. Emergency services were called. Neighbors gathered. The building descended into chaos. The initial assessment raised questions almost immediately. There were no signs of forced entry. The door had not been damaged. The windows were intact. Nothing of value appeared to be missing. The crime did not resemble burglary. It did not resemble a random act. The timeline was narrow. The parents had left at 6:35. The neighbor knocked at 7:10. In that window of approximately 35 minutes, 4 children were killed. No screams were reported. No unusual noises were recalled. In a building where sound traveled easily, that silence was striking. Investigators were confronted with a disturbing implication. The children had likely opened the door themselves. Whoever entered the apartment was not a stranger. He was someone they recognized. Someone they trusted enough to let inside. That realization would shape every theory that followed. Because the crime did not begin with intrusion. It began with access. And once that door was opened, the Tan family's routine, built over years of careful discipline, was destroyed in minutes. When authorities arrived at Block 58 in Geylang Bahru, the apartment had already begun to fill with noise. Neighbors gathered in the corridor. Whispers traveled faster than facts. Within hours, the news spread beyond the building and into the wider community. Singapore had not seen many crimes of this magnitude, especially not ones involving children. The shock was immediate and collective. Police secured the apartment as quickly as possible, but the effort was complicated by the sheer number of onlookers. Evidence preservation was difficult. This was 1979, a time before advanced forensic protocols became standard practice. Even so, investigators understood immediately that what lay before them was not a spontaneous act of violence. The bodies of the 4 children were found inside the bathroom, piled together in a confined space. They were still wearing their sleepwear. According to the autopsy reports, each child had suffered numerous wounds across the body. The youngest child showed extensive injuries to the face, indicating intense and sustained aggression. The eldest child's injuries suggested resistance. In his hand, investigators later noted strands of hair, initially believed to belong to the attacker, but eventually identified as his own. The conclusion was unavoidable. At least one of the children had fought back. Despite the brutality, the apartment itself told a quieter story. There were no overturned furniture pieces, no broken locks, no shattered windows. The front door showed no damage. Nothing of monetary value appeared to be missing. Cash, household items, and personal belongings remained untouched. This was not a robbery that had spiraled out of control. Bloodstains were found near the kitchen sink and along the bathroom area. Investigators noted signs that water had been used. The sink appeared recently cleaned. The implication was troubling. The perpetrator had taken time to wash up after the attack. That detail alone suggested familiarity with the space and confidence that no one would interrupt him. No fingerprints were recovered. No footwear impressions were found. The suspected murder weapons, believed to be a large cleaver and a dagger, were never located. Whoever committed the crime left with what they brought and erased as much as they could before leaving. The estimated time of death narrowed the window further. The parents had left at 6:35 in the morning. The neighbor knocked at 7:10. Within that span of roughly 35 minutes, 4 children were attacked and killed. The efficiency of the act disturbed investigators. This was not hesitation. This was execution. One of the most perplexing aspects of the case was the absence of noise. The attack occurred during morning hours when neighbors were awake and preparing for work or school. In a densely populated housing block, cries or commotion would normally be expected. Yet no one reported hearing screams, fighting, or anything unusual. This led investigators to consider a disturbing possibility. It was theorized that there may have been more than one perpetrator. One individual could have restrained or distracted the children while another carried out the killings. The bathroom, small and enclosed, could have been used to isolate each child individually. While this theory could not be confirmed, it remained part of the investigative discussion due to the logistical difficulty of controlling 4 children in silence. Another conclusion, however, became increasingly clear. The perpetrator was not an outsider. The children had likely opened the door voluntarily. This meant the attacker was someone they recognized and trusted. Someone who knew their routine. Someone who understood that the parents would be gone and that no adult supervision would return for hours. With the physical evidence exhausted, investigators turned outward. They began examining the Tan family's relationships, finances, and social connections. Attention briefly focused on a rotating savings fund the parents participated in, a system in which members contributed regularly and received pooled funds over time. There was a clause stating that if a member passed away, remaining participants could benefit financially. Investigators questioned whether someone facing financial distress might have acted violently. The theory quickly weakened. Even if such a motive existed, harming children would not guarantee financial gain. The parents were the direct contributors. Removing them would have been the logical target, not their children. Another line of inquiry explored the possibility of debt. Investigators asked whether the family owed money to anyone or had disputes with creditors. The parents denied any outstanding loans or conflicts. Financial records did not support the theory of intimidation or retaliation. As each explanation failed to account for the facts, one conclusion remained. This was a premeditated act. The killer had selected the time. He had selected the victims. He had planned his entry and his exit. And he had vanished into the morning without leaving behind a single clear trail. The case had moved from shock to confusion. And soon it would move into something even more unsettling. Because weeks after the murders, the killer would make it known that he was not finished speaking. 2 weeks after the massacre, as Singapore prepared for the Lunar New Year, the Tan family received a letter. At a time when grief was still raw and unanswered questions dominated every waking moment, the envelope arrived without warning. What it contained would deepen the horror of the case and confirm what investigators already feared. The letter was a New Year greeting card. On its cover was an illustration of children playing. Inside, a message was written in Chinese. The words were brief, deliberate, and cruel. It stated that the Tan family no longer had any descendants left. The message ended with laughter and a signature. The murderer. For investigators, the letter changed everything. This was no longer a silent crime. The perpetrator had chosen to speak. And more importantly, he demonstrated knowledge that only someone close to the family would possess. The message referenced the idea that Li Ming could no longer have children. At the time of the murders, she was only 30 years old. There was no public reason to assume she could not conceive again. Yet after the birth of her 4th child, she had undergone a tubal ligation procedure. This information was not widely shared. It was personal, private. The fact that the sender knew it reinforced a chilling conclusion. The killer was not an outsider. He had intimate knowledge of the family's life. The letter also revealed something else. The murders were not impulsive. They were purposeful. The children were not collateral damage. They were the intended targets. Months passed without progress. Then, a new lead emerged from an unexpected source. An anonymous taxi driver came forward with information that would briefly reignite hope. According to his statement, on the morning of May 6th, around 8 o'clock, his taxi was parked near lot 96, not far from Block 58. A young man, estimated to be around 20 years old, approached the vehicle. His clothing was heavily stained with blood. At first, the driver assumed the man had been involved in an accident and urged him to seek medical attention. The passenger refused. Instead, he asked to be driven to another street. During the ride, the driver became increasingly uneasy. When the passenger exited the taxi, the driver heard the sound of metal striking the car door. He later stated that he believed the man was carrying a knife. The outline of a blade was visible beneath his jacket. By the time this testimony reached police, valuable time had already passed. Even so, the description aligned disturbingly well with the crime timeline. Based on the driver's account, investigators, working with the Tan family, identified a suspect. He was known only by a nickname, Uncle. The man was Malaysian and lived nearby. He was familiar with the family and frequently visited their apartment to borrow the telephone. He knew the children. He knew their morning routine. He knew the parents left early for work. According to those who recognized him, he fit the general description provided by the taxi driver. Police detained the suspect for questioning. For a brief period, it appeared the case might finally move forward. But after 2 weeks, he was released. No charges were filed. The reasons were never made public. It remains unclear whether he provided an alibi, whether evidence was insufficient, or whether procedural limitations prevented further action. After his release, the man moved away. He disappeared from the area and from public discussion. The investigation stalled once again. In the absence of official answers, speculation filled the vacuum. Online forums, private discussions, and informal investigations produced a range of theories. Some suggested the motive was romantic in nature. The argument was that if the children were the primary targets, the act may have been driven by obsession, rejection, or jealousy. Others focused on money, citing rumors of a lottery ticket worth 45,000 United States dollars, an enormous sum at the time, and a dispute over its ownership. More extreme theories alleged hidden criminal activity involving the parents, including drug trafficking or associations with organized groups. These claims were firmly denied by the Tan family and were never supported by evidence. Investigators have consistently stated that no proof exists to substantiate such accusations. What all theories shared was a common focal point. They circled back to the same individual. The same access. The same familiarity. And yet none crossed the threshold required by law. In the end, the case returned to its original state. 4 children murdered. A killer who chose his moment carefully. A message sent to ensure the pain endured. And a suspect who walked free. The passage of time has only complicated the search for truth. Witnesses have moved away or passed on. Memories have faded. Physical evidence, already limited, has deteriorated or been lost. What remains is a case defined not only by violence, but by silence. A silence enforced not by lack of interest, but by the absence of proof. And that silence would follow the Tan family for the rest of their lives. In the decades that followed the massacre, the Tan family was left to live with an absence that could never be explained away. 4 children were taken in a single morning, and no official conclusion ever arrived to justify why. The investigation, once filled with urgency and public attention, slowly faded into silence. Tan Queen and Lee Ming withdrew from public life. They stopped operating their school transportation service and remained in the same apartment, despite the unbearable weight of memory attached to every wall. According to those close to them, leaving the home felt like abandoning the last place their children had existed. Staying, however, meant reliving the tragedy daily. 2 years later, in 1981, Lee Ming underwent surgery to reverse her previous sterilization. She later gave birth to a healthy baby boy. While the child brought a measure of comfort, he did not replace what had been lost. He grew up under the shadow of a crime that defined his family before he was born. As the years passed, the case grew colder. Witnesses moved away. Some passed on. Physical evidence, already limited at the time of the murders, deteriorated. The suspect known as Uncle was never publicly charged. His whereabouts became unknown. With no new leads, the file remained open in name only. Nearly half a century later, in 2021, a crime prevention organization in Singapore revisited the case. Their review highlighted inconsistencies that had persisted for decades. They clarified that the crime scene was located on the 4th floor of the building, not the 5th, as had been widely reported. They also raised concerns about the lack of cooperation from neighbors at the time, suggesting that crucial information may have been withheld. The review reignited a small glimmer of hope. But reality quickly followed. Most potential witnesses were no longer reachable. Memories had faded. The opportunity for justice had narrowed. Ton Queen has since passed away. Lee Ming is now nearly 80 years old. When she learned that the case had been reviewed again, she reportedly broke down in tears. Not because she expected resolution, but because acknowledgement itself had become rare. The pain, for her, had never aged. Only the world around it had moved on. This case is not remembered solely for its brutality, but for what it represents. A crime committed in a crowded neighborhood, in broad daylight, without resistance from the environment around it. A reminder that silence, whether born from fear, familiarity, or indifference, can be as powerful as violence itself. The massacre of the Tan children remains unresolved. No perpetrator has been named. No sentence has been handed down. And no explanation has been officially accepted. But unresolved does not mean forgotten. As long as the case remains open, however quietly, the possibility remains that the truth may one day surface. Until then, the story of 4 children killed in their own home stands as one of Singapore's darkest unanswered questions. A file left open, waiting for a voice that has not yet spoken.